Hello, this is Gill here at engVid, and today we have a lesson on, well, how to increase your vocabulary just by adding a little bit at the beginning of a word to make it negative. So that's called a negative prefix. So for example, this is probably one word you will know, the word correct. When you get something right, correct. If you say incorrect, then that's the negative, meaning not correct. So you can automatically add a word to your vocabulary just by adding the negative bit at the beginning. Okay, so we're looking today at different, what are called prefixes, because you put it in front of the word. In English, there are 12 of these prefixes, so we're going to look at them in two different lessons. In this lesson, we're looking at 5 of them, and then in the other lesson, we'll look at 7. So, does that add up to 7? Yes, that adds up to 12. Good. So, the reason we have 5 here and 7 in the other one, all of these begin with the letter I. So we've put these all together, but the other 7 are different. They're all different. So let's have a look at these. So increase your vocabulary by using a negative prefix. So the first prefix, which is used for a lot of words, you have to know which is the right one to use. You can't just use any negative prefix with any word. They belong with certain words. So the ones that belong with in, here are some examples. There are lots more. So if something is complete, it's complete, everything is there. But if it's incomplete, if your homework is incomplete, it means you haven't finished it. So is your homework complete? Or is it incomplete? Do you still need to do some more work on it? So that's incomplete, the negative. Okay. So, and then when you get your homework back, is it all correct? Did you get full marks? Or was there anything in it that was incorrect? If you got something incorrect, you maybe lost a mark or 2. Okay, so incorrect. If you're efficient, you do things very efficiently, very well, you have a good method for doing things. But if you're inefficient, or if somebody is inefficient, it means they're not very well organised. They don't do things in a very logical way. It takes them longer to do it. They might make mistakes and so on. So that's inefficient. Okay. Formal. We sometimes talk about formal language, and then the opposite of that is informal. Informal language is when you're having a conversation with a friend. You might be using slang terms and so on. But if you're meeting somebody important, or you're going for a job interview, you will be fairly formal. So you're either formal or informal, depending on who you're with, okay, and who you're talking to. So informal. Human, we're all human. But sometimes if people do something bad, it's called inhuman. If someone does something really bad to somebody else, they're being inhuman. They're not thinking of that person's feelings. They're hurting them in some way. So you could say that was inhuman, what he did. Maybe to give to get, if someone leaves a job, they're given the sack, they're asked to go in a bad way. It's not very nice, it's inhuman to just tell somebody you've got to go. So human, inhuman. secure. If you feel secure, you feel safe. If you feel insecure, then you don't feel safe. So secure, insecure. And then finally for in, visible. If something's visible, you can see it. It's right there. I can see the camera. It's visible. But if something is invisible, if the camera is hidden and I don't know I'm being filmed, then it's an invisible camera. So visible, invisible. Anything you can't see is invisible. Okay. There's one funny little exception with the in prefix. If somebody's famous, then they're a celebrity. They're very well known. They're on television all the time. They're in films, etc. So they're famous person. If you see them in the street, you think, oh my goodness, wow, it's that famous actor right near me in the street. Okay, so you might think that the prefix in with famous would mean the opposite, that they're not famous, but it doesn't mean that. This is an exception. If something or somebody is infamous, and the pronunciation changes a little bit, the pronunciation of the A, famous, but infamous. So the A vowel sound changes. If somebody is infamous, or if some event, something that happened was infamous, it does still mean famous. Everybody knows about it, but it's famous in a bad way. Okay, so if someone does something really bad and it's on television and everybody knows that they did this awful thing, maybe it's a bit like a gangster in Chicago. One of the gangsters was, who they had gangs and they were shooting each other and so on. Their names were very well known. So you could say the infamous gangster, Al Capone, for example. Al Capone, who was one of the Chicago gangsters of the 1920s, 30s. He was infamous. Everyone had heard of him. He was famous, but he was famous for a bad reason. So that made him infamous. Okay. Right. So that's the in prefix. Then there's one that's an im with an M. Okay. So again, there's no particular rule here, but you just have to sort of get used to whether it sounds right or not. So you may have to try different prefixes to see if it sounds right. You have to just try and see if you can get it. So you get used to it as you use them. So with the word mature, if you're mature, you're sort of grown up, adult, you behave in a mature way. But someone who is not mature can be called immature. So this one, it's a double M. So I-double-M, immature. So if someone behaves in an immature way, they behave like a child. You might say, oh, stop being so immature. When are you going to grow up? Behave like an adult. So that's immature. Okay. Patient. If you're patient, you're happy to wait and not get annoyed. But if you get irritated and you think, oh, when is something going to happen? If you're waiting, or you're waiting for a friend to arrive and they're a bit late, and you start to get really annoyed and you start walking up and down, getting angry, that's impatient. So patient, impatient. Okay, so perfect. We all like to try to be perfect, I think, do everything well, but it doesn't always work out that way. So sometimes something can be imperfect, not perfect. It may be 95% perfect, 96% perfect, but there's just one little thing that's wrong with it. So that's imperfect. Okay. Polite, also, we try to be polite all the time, and be nice to everybody, polite. But if someone is not polite, if they're a bit rude, if they're in a bad mood or something, or they may always be like that, then they're impolite. That was an impolite thing to say. Okay, not polite. And then this one you probably know, possible. If something is possible, it means you can do it. It can be done. But if it's impossible, then it's not possible. You may know of a television program, also a film called Mission Impossible. And that's a bit of a challenge, really, because the people who are in it, they actually prove that it is possible. It seems impossible to begin with, but they're very strong and clever, and they try to do something that seems impossible. So sometimes if we think something's impossible, we just have to try a bit harder. It may be possible after all. So possible, impossible. Okay, so moving on to IL. So there's a good sort of clue here. A lot of the words that go with IL begin with an L, which means that you get a double L, I-double-L. So that helps you to remember which prefix to use with which word. So with legal, for example, meaning something is okay to do. It's not against the law, it's legal. If someone said, is this legal, what we're doing? Is it legal? And you might say, no, I think it's illegal. So we shouldn't really do that. It's illegal. It's against the law. So you could be arrested for doing that. The police will come and take you to put you in prison or something. So illegal. You have to be careful what you do and to know what you can and can't do, depending what country you're in. It varies. So illegal. Legible is, I hope my writing is legible, meaning you can read it. I hope you can read it. I try to make it clear. So something that is legible, if you have legible handwriting, people can read it. But I know some people with very bad handwriting, and they can't even read their own handwriting. You know, they write something, and then 5 minutes later, they're trying to read it, and, oh, what's that? What did I put? So if the person themselves can't read their own handwriting, there's not much hope. But anyway, legible and illegible. So his handwriting is illegible. I just can't read it. Okay, right. Well, this is a good one for learning English or any language. Literate means you can read. You're able to read. There are some people who can't read. They have not learnt to read for various reasons. So if someone is literate, it means they can read printed words. But someone who is illiterate, I-double-L, illiterate, has never learned to read and write. So that's an important one. And then finally in this column, logical. If something is logical, it makes sense. It's sort of one thing follows from another. Logical. But if somebody has an argument about something and they make an argument which is illogical, then it doesn't make sense. It doesn't follow. They may sound as if they know what they're talking about, but if you analyse it, you find, no, that's not logical. There's a big hole in that argument. It's not logical. It's illogical. Okay. Then, IR. So regular. If something's regular, it happens at every, in a regular way, with the same sort of spaces in between all the time. So that's regular. And so the opposite is irregular. Again, the little clue here is that a lot of these words begin with an R. So you end up with an IRR for these ones. So it helps you to remember which prefix to use. So irregular. Relevant, if something is relevant, it belongs with, if somebody's arguing again and they say something and it is relevant to the discussion, then it's part of that subject. But if someone says something that has nothing to do with that subject, you can say, well, that's irrelevant. That's got nothing to do with what we're talking about. It's irrelevant. Okay. This one, usually this one is used with the negative, probably more than the positive. But if something is resistible, it means you can resist it. It's not all that attractive. But we tend to talk about things which are irresistible. Things like chocolate, for example, I find irresistible. It's very hard to resist if someone offers you a chocolate. Oh, they're irresistible. But to say resistible, this is actually used as a bit of an insult. If you don't like something, if someone's made some coffee and you don't like the taste, you can say, well, that coffee is quite resistible. I don't feel like drinking it, really. It's easy to resist it, not to drink it. So irresistible is used much more, I think, in the negative sense. Okay, so responsible. If you're responsible in the way you do something, you're careful, you're considerate, you're thinking of the consequences, you don't do anything silly, so you're being responsible. But if people don't think about the consequences, and if they're very careless and they don't really, they don't do things carefully at all, then they're irresponsible. That was irresponsible to, for example, if someone is trying to get onto a train and the train has already started moving and the doors are open, and somebody tries to jump on the train while it's moving, you could say, well, that was a very irresponsible thing to do. They could have hurt themselves, they could have hurt somebody else, they could have caused an accident, so it's irresponsible. Okay, then reversible. To reverse something is to turn it the other way round. Reversible. You can get reversible coats, for example, which are one colour on one side, and then when you turn them the other way, they're a different colour on the inside, which then becomes the outside. So you can have a reversible coat, which is like having two coats, because they will probably have two different colours, which is rather nice. But irreversible if you say that was an irreversible decision, once you have decided to do something and you do it, you can't go back to how it was before. That was irreversible. Some irreversible damage has been done. You can't put it right afterwards. Okay, it's permanently damaged, whatever it was. Okay, and then finally, one little one, and I only know of one word that has ig as the negative prefix, and that's the word noble. So if you're noble, it means you're a sort of an honest person. You do the right thing all the time. You don't do bad things to people. But someone who is the opposite of that is called ignoble. It's a slightly strange, old-fashioned word, but ignoble. If someone behaves badly, they're not behaving in a noble, honest way. Okay. And then finally, for this lesson, just to mention that don't assume that every word beginning with any of these letters is always going to be a negative, because there are some words that just happen to start with those letters. So here are just a few examples: influence, impact, improve, illusion, irrigate, ignite. They're not negatives. They just happen to start with those letters. Okay, so to influence is to get somebody to sort of believe what you think, or to get them to do something. Impact is if you have an impact on somebody, they take notice of something that you've done. Improve is what I hope you're trying to do all the time with your English. Improve your English, so I'm sure you know that word. Illusion is when you imagine you've seen something, but it's an illusion. It's not really there. Irrigate is when, if you have a very dry area of land and you maybe want to grow some crops in it, you have to irrigate the soil to make it wet enough. You put some water on it to help the seeds to grow. So that's irrigate. And finally, ignite means to make something burn, to set fire to something, to ignite. Okay, so I hope that's been helpful and will help you to add to your vocabulary. And please look at our other lesson on negative prefixes, and also go to the website engVid.com, do the quiz there, and see you again very soon. Okay, bye.